Beneath the glamorous surface, Marilyn Monroe hid a secret recording so raw it would have dismantled the Hollywood machine in a single night. This is the forbidden confession of the woman the cameras were never allowed to see. The night the blonde bombshell finally broke, and a humble taxi driver became the only person to hear her true voice. The night began not with a dream, but with a sensory assault. The flashbulbs of the Golden Globes were still stinging her eyes, 1,000 white needles of light piercing her weary soul, leaving behind ghostly violet orbs that danced in her vision. Snap, snap, snap. The sound of the cameras felt like a firing squad. Marilyn stood on the edge of the sidewalk, the cold night air biting at her bare shoulders with a cruelty that the velvet ropes of the studio system couldn't hold back. She realized that she could not return to the hollow, echoing the silence of her house in Brentwood alone. Behind her, the party roared like a hungry beast, a cacophony of clinking crystal, the shrill pitch of fake laughter, and the suffocating scent of stale champagne from people who loved the shimmering icon but ignored the woman bleeding beneath the sequins. But something else haunted her tonight. A frantic, unanswered phone call she had placed from a claustrophobic wooden booth to a man who had once promised protection, only to let the phone ring until it fell into a mocking, rhythmic silence. That silence was the final straw, a mystery looming over her that made the artificial lights and the forced laughter of this specific night feel like a slow suffocation of her spirit. She signaled for a taxi, her gloved hand trembling just enough for the heavy diamonds on her wrist to catch the moonlight, their cold fire mocking the emptiness in her chest. She felt the weight of those jewels not as wealth, but as shackles that tethered her to a life she no longer recognized. When the yellow cab pulled to the curb, it felt like a life raft in a sea of overwhelming, suffocating glamour. The driver, an older man named Elias, whose face was a map of gentle wisdom and long nights, didn't turn around for an autograph or a leering grin. He simply nodded, his movements slow and respectful, acknowledging her presence without demanding her persona. As she slid into the back seat, the grounding, honest scent of old leather, faint tobacco, and peppermint tea enveloped her. A sharp, healing contrast to the expensive French perfumes and stagnant cigarette smoke she had just escaped. The seat was worn, a soft embrace of cracked vinyl that didn't care about the designer label on her dress. Marilyn looked out at the blurred neon lights of Los Angeles, feeling the heavy mask of the blonde bombshell begin to crumble. She wasn't the most famous woman in the world in this moving sanctuary. She was just a tired, frightened girl lost in the dark. "Just drive," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread, and as the engine hummed a steady, comforting lullaby, the first tear tracked through the thick porcelain layer of her stage makeup, carving a path of truth across a face that belonged to everyone but herself. She watched the palm trees pass like tall, dark sentinels, wondering if any of them knew the real girl hiding behind the famous name. She reached into her evening bag, her fingers fumbling past a silver lighter and her keys until she found a simple, unadorned handkerchief. Her hand brushed against a heavy gold Max Factor compact, a solid weight of brass and pressed powder that acted as a golden coffin for her freckles, the literal armor she wore daily. To the world, that gold case was a symbol of beauty, but to her it was the heavy door to a prison. She thought about the thousands of hours she had spent staring into mirrors, watching a team of artists paint over her flaws until the person staring back was someone she didn't know. As her thumb brushed the cool, polished metal clasp, the sharp click of its opening echoed through the quiet cab like a gunshot, a startling reminder of the violence of being constantly watched. With a slow, deliberate motion that felt like an act of holy rebellion, she wiped the iconic crimson stain from her lips. She smeared the perfect red line the world demanded she wear like a brand of ownership, leaving behind a smudge that looked like a wounded wing on the white fabric. For the first time in a decade, the Marilyn mask was being dismantled piece by piece in the dark, leaving behind the pale, raw features of the girl who used to be Norma Jean, a girl who still lived behind the blue eyes that had seen far too much. The handkerchief was soon stained with the remnants of her public self, a smudge of pink and beige that looked like a bruised cloud. Elias continued to drive with a steady, practiced hand, his gaze fixed on the asphalt ahead as if he were guarding her privacy with his life. He didn't peek through the rearview mirror to catch a glimpse of the fallen star. Instead, he reached over with a quiet grace and turned the heater up, sensing the deep chill radiating from her despite the heavy white fur wrap draped over her shoulders. This intuitive act of care caused a fresh wave of emotion to rise in her chest, a tightness that made it hard to draw a full breath. In the sterile, high-ceilinged halls of the studios, powerful men in expensive suits gave her diamonds and furs to keep her under their thumb, to ensure she remained a profitable ghost for the stockholders. But this man gave her warmth simply because he noticed she was a human being who was shivering in the night. She looked at her hands, now stripped of the character she played for the cameras, and felt the immense crushing weight of the industry's expectations finally beginning to lift in the safety of the shadows. She remembered the early days when she thought the frame would be a soft blanket, but it had turned out to be a cage made of ice that burned to the touch. To the fans, she was a flickering, two-dimensional image of desire, a dream that lived on a screen. But in the dim, amber glow of the taxi, she felt a different presence, one that reminded her of the fatherly figure she had spent a lifetime searching for in the cold, transactional faces of strangers. Elias had the weathered, honest look of a man who understood that silence was sometimes the only appropriate response to a soul in mourning. He wasn't looking for a headline or a story to tell his friends. He was a silent witness to a woman whose inner spark was being snuffed out under the immense pressure of a dream that had long ago turned into a waking nightmare of isolation. We are just beginning to peel back the layers of the woman the world thought they knew. If you believe that every person, no matter how famous, deserves a moment of true privacy, hit that like button to help us share more stories like this one. Now, let's listen to what Norma Jean had to say when the cameras stopped rolling. Elias had a small dictaphone resting on the dashboard, a humble device with a spinning brown reel of magnetic tape, a mechanical confessor his son had given him to record the stories of the city. He had started using it to capture the rhythmic sounds of the midnight streets, the rain on the windshield, and the occasional wisdom of a traveler. That night, the little machine remained active, its tiny red light glowing like a watchful, unblinking eye in the darkness, capturing the rhythmic hiss of the tape. It was never meant to capture a scandal, but rather the raw, unfiltered frequency of a soul that had finally reached its absolute breaking point. However, the stakes were higher than the humble driver could have ever imagined. If a studio executive had found this tape in 1961, the truth of her resentment and the depth of her despair would have ended her career instantly. The industry did not allow its goddesses to be broken. It demanded they stay perfect and silent. It was a forbidden treasure, a recording of a living legend admitting that the golden dream was a hollow lie. Marilyn leaned forward, her eyes catching the hypnotic circular reflection of the spinning reel in the dark glass of the windshield. She felt an odd kinship with that tape, something small and fragile being wound tighter and tighter by a machine it couldn't control. She didn't ask him to turn it off. Perhaps she felt that if someone didn't record her truth tonight, the real girl would eventually be erased from existence beneath the weight of the silver screen. She began to speak in the low, melodic, and weary tone of a woman who had spent too many nights talking to the four cold walls of an empty mansion. She started with the date, January 15th, 1961, noting how the stars over the Pacific looked so much brighter when you weren't standing in the blinding glare of a spotlight. She told the recorder about the little girl who used to sit in the very back row of movie theaters, eating a nickel bag of popcorn and wishing she could jump inside the screen to escape the harsh reality of the foster system. She could still remember the smell of floor wax, the ticking of a clock that didn't belong to her, and the way the light from the projector looked like a highway to a better world. The problem was that once she had finally climbed inside that screen and became the image everyone adored, she found it was made of cold, flat glass and flickering shadows that offered absolutely no warmth to a freezing soul. Every time she paused to catch her breath, the soft, rhythmic click-clack of the tape recorder filled the gap, a mechanical witness to an unveiling that would have brought the entire Hollywood machine to a crashing standstill. She spoke of the scripts that felt like lies and the directors who treated her like a prop to be moved and lighted. As the road stretched toward the dark, salt-sprayed coast, she began to speak of the childhood she had missed, and the tears started to fall with a renewed purpose, splashing onto the silk of her gown like rain on a parched, neglected garden. She felt the salt on her skin and the weight of the night pressing against the glass, realizing that for once she didn't have to be beautiful to be heard. Marilyn talked about a girl named Norma Jean who didn't want the world. She just wanted a simple Sunday dinner. She wanted people who knew her middle name and her favorite color. She didn't speak of the glittering premieres or the roar of the crowds, but of a quiet, sun-drenched kitchen she had seen through a stranger's window when she was only 6 years old. A kitchen where a family sat together in the simple, holy ritual of passing a bread basket. She remembered the way the steam rose from a pot of soup and the sound of a mother humming a song she didn't recognize, a melody of belonging that she had spent her life trying to hum back to herself. To the world, she was a goddess carved from light and desire. To herself, she was still that lonely child standing on the outside of the glass, watching a life she was never invited to join. She told Elias about the scent of laundry drying in a summer breeze and the hollow, echoing ache of never having a single chair in a house that belonged only to her. She thought of the cardboard suitcases she had carried from one house to another, always a guest, never a daughter, always one mistake away from being sent to the next stranger. The problem wasn't the poverty of her youth, it was the poverty of the spirit, the terrifying realization that no one was ever coming to claim her as their own treasure. She spoke of long nights lying awake in foster homes, listening to the ticking of a clock in a stranger's hallway, imagining a father who would walk through the front door, scoop her up in his arms, and tell her that she finally irrevocably mattered. She described the sensory details of a normal life with a longing that was physically painful to hear, the rough texture of a father's flannel shirt, the distant buzzing sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning, and the sweet, sugary taste of a birthday cake that wasn't meant for a photo opportunity. She could almost taste the frosting in her mind, thick and homemade, and see the flickering light of candles that weren't being held for a camera. She confessed to the worrying tape that she would trade every diamond she owned, every fur wrap, and every ounce of her global fame for just one solitary memory of a man looking at her with genuine pride, not because she was beautiful, but simply because she was his daughter. Elias listened with a heavy silence, his own heart breaking for the woman who was worshipped by millions but cherished by no one in the way a soul truly needs. She realized that the desperate search for that missing father had driven her into the arms of powerful men who only wanted to own the legend. As she spoke, the rigid, perfect posture she maintained for the public began to soften and fail, her shoulders slumping as she surrendered to a grief that had been decades in the making. She wasn't just recounting the past, she was mourning the person she might have been if someone had simply loved her when she was small. "They didn't fall in love with me, Elias," she said, her voice cracking. "They fell in love with a ghost I created out of necessity. A girl who always smiles, even when she's dying inside." She looked at her reflection and saw the ghost looking back, the platinum hair shimmering like a crown of thorns. Then, as if realizing the gloom of the cab was becoming too heavy, she let out a soft, melodic laugh. She told Elias about a time on a movie set when she had accidentally walked into the wrong trailer and ended up sharing a ham sandwich with a bewildered carpenter who had no idea who she was, until she tried to pay him with a signed headshot. He had just looked at the photo and then at her and asked if she was new in town, offering her half of his sandwich because she looked like she hadn't eaten in days. That man hadn't seen the star. He had seen a hungry girl. This brief moment of levity made the following low of her confession feel 10 times more powerful for the driver. In the quiet of the moving taxi, the name Marilyn Monroe sounded like a gilded, ornate cage that was locked from the outside. The cost of that name was a debt she paid every single hour of every single day. She told the driver about the grueling morning spent in front of a 3-way mirror, watching her own tired face disappear beneath thick layers of paint and false lashes until the girl she knew was lost to the world once again. She described the smell of the hairspray and the sting of the peroxide, the physical transformation that felt like a slow, daily erasure of Norma Jean. She talked about the way the cameras felt like eyes that were eating her, bit by bit, until there was nothing left but the image. The problem was that the more the public adored the icon, the more the woman inside felt herself withering away into a mist of nothingness. She was a commodity owned by stockholders and boardrooms, and she confessed that sometimes she looked into her own reflection and didn't recognize the blue eyes staring back at her. The industry had taken her natural laughter and turned it into a trademarked giggle. They had taken her natural walk and turned it into a spectacle. They had taken her heart and broken it into a million jagged pieces for the sake of a box office return. Elias remained a steady, unmoving presence, his eyes never judging her. He understood she was a woman who had been systematically robbed of her own identity, traded for a fame that now felt like cold ashes in her mouth. Every word she spoke was a brick removed from the high defensive wall she had built around her spirit for survival. She was a legend to the masses, but in this small sanctuary she was just a woman. Wondering if there was anything left of her own soul beneath the peroxide, the pearls, and the pain. She pulled a crumpled photograph from her purse, holding it with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. But there was one secret she held even closer than her childhood, a dream so fragile she feared the wind would break it if she dared to whisper it. It wasn't a picture of a glamorous movie set or a famous leading man. It was a modest, weather-beaten cottage sitting on a patch of grass by a restless gray sea. She described the way she imagined the wood of the porch would feel under her bare feet, warm from the sun and salt-stained, and how the air would smell of sea salt instead of stage makeup. This was her secret altar, a vision of a life where the name on the mailbox belonged to someone who didn't have to pretend to be happy every second of the day. "I want to be a grandmother one day," she whispered, the words catching in her throat and turning into a small, hopeful sob. She spoke of a future where she could sit on that porch with natural silver hair, watching the tide roll in while the world forgot she ever existed. She could see herself wearing an old sweater, holding a cup of tea, and listening to the gulls instead of the paparazzi. It's rare to hear a legend speak with such raw honesty about the life she actually wanted. Before we reveal the final heart-wrenching moment between Marilyn and the driver, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Do you think true peace is possible when the whole world is watching? Let's start a conversation about the human side of fame. The problem was that the machinery of Hollywood didn't allow for the indignity of aging or the luxury of peace. It demanded eternal, frozen youth, leaving no room for a woman to grow old with grace. She fantasized about buying fresh tart berries at a local market, where her neighbors only knew her as the lady who liked to garden, never once suspecting she was the woman who had once set the world on fire with a single look. In this dream, she wasn't a goddess. She was a friend, a neighbor, and most importantly, a mother. She told the driver about the children she never had and the soft lullabies she had practiced in her head during the lonely hours between movie takes. She wanted to feel the simple, grounding warmth of a small hand in hers, to be deeply, truly loved for the simple fact that she was present, not because she was beautiful. Elias looked at the photo and then at the woman in his backseat, seeing the profound tragedy of a person who had everything the world desired, yet possessed absolutely nothing her heart truly needed to survive another year. The disconnect between her reality and her wish was a canyon she feared she could never cross, a distance measured in legal contracts and public expectations. She feared the icon would eventually take the life of the woman entirely, leaving only a hollow shell for the world to pick over. But tonight, in the back of this yellow taxi, the dream felt almost possible, as if the road might lead to the sea instead of back to her lonely bedroom. She tucked the photo back, her movements slow and tired, as if the dream were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small striped peppermint, a simple, sticky gesture of comfort that was about to finally shatter her last remaining defenses. Elias handed her the peppermint the same way he used to for his own children when their hearts were heavy. He didn't say a word, just held it out between the seats, the striped candy catching the glow of a passing street lamp like a tiny beacon of hope. As her gloved fingers closed around the tiny, crinkling candy, the legendary composure she had perfected for years didn't just crack, it shattered. This act of grandfatherly kindness from a man who wanted nothing but her comfort unlocked a lifetime of suppressed, suffocating sorrow. She didn't cry like a movie star with carefully placed tears and a trembling lip. She sobbed with a raw, guttural intensity. She sobbed with a jagged, relentless grief. She sobbed for 34 years of held breath. Her forehead pressed against the back of the front seat, the rough fabric scratching against her skin. Her shoulders heaving as the weight of studio contracts, failed marriages, and the crushing loneliness of fame poured out in a relentless, salty tide. She wasn't a goddess on a pedestal tonight. She was a wounded soul who had finally found a safe place to bleed without being judged. Elias didn't try to hush her or offer empty platitudes. He simply let her cry, his hand resting gently on the top of the seat near her shoulder, a solid, unmoving anchor in her emotional storm. He understood this was a necessary shedding of a skin that had become too tight for her to breathe. She told him, through broken, jagged gasps, that she was so tired of being brave and so terrified that, if she stopped being Marilyn for even a second, there would be nothing left of her. She felt like she was disappearing into the upholstery of the car, dissolving into the night air of Los Angeles. The peppermint sat in her palm, a reminder of the simple, sweet things she had been forced to trade for the cold, hard brilliance of the spotlight. She confessed she felt like a bird that had been taught to sing beautifully in a golden cage, and now that the door was finally standing open, she had forgotten how to fly. The interior of the taxi became a cathedral of catharsis. As her sobs eventually slowed to a rhythmic trembling, she felt a wonderful lightness, as if she had finally set down a trunk of leaden weights. She looked up at the rearview mirror and saw Elias's eyes, moist with a deep, silent empathy, and realized this stranger had given her more dignity in 45 minutes than Hollywood had in a decade. He had seen the woman behind the curtain, the one without the makeup and the light, and he hadn't turned away. The taxi pulled up to her darkened driveway in Brentwood, but neither of them moved to open the door, as if the air inside the cab had become too precious to let go. Marilyn looked at the looming, dark hedges that hid her house from the world, realizing she would soon have to step back into the role that was slowly erasing her soul from the inside out. She reached into the folds of her white fur wrap and pulled out a delicate silk scarf, a piece of fabric like a captured cloud that still carried the faint scent of jasmine and the warmth of her own skin. She didn't offer him a stack of $100 bills. She knew that would only cheapen the holy connection they had built. Instead, She leaned forward and draped the scarf over the passenger seat, her eyes meeting Elias's in the mirror with a look of profound, tearful gratitude. It was a silent pact, a gift from the girl who used to be Norma Jean to the man who had treated her like a person of inherent worth. Elias touched the silk, his weathered hand strong and honest against the pale fabric. He promised her, without needing a single word, that her secrets were safe with him, guarded by a loyalty that money could never buy. He had seen the most famous woman in the world at her most vulnerable and broken, and his only response was fatherly protection. Marilyn realized this man was perhaps the only person in all of Hollywood who truly knew her heart. The problem of her loneliness hadn't been solved, but for one night it had been shared, and that made the burden feel light enough to carry to her front door. She opened the door, and the cool, damp night air rushed in, bringing the reality of her lonely life back into focus. She stepped out onto the gravel, the sound of her heels sharp and final in the silence, and paused to look back at the yellow taxi one last time. Elias nodded to her, a slow, respectful gesture acknowledging her dignity as a woman. She watched his red tail lights disappear into the Los Angeles night, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and newfound strength. The dictaphone on the dashboard finally reached the end of its tape, the reel spinning in a silent, futile circle now that the story was over. Elias drove home, his hand resting on the silk scarf, knowing he had witnessed a quiet miracle of the human spirit. He would never tell a soul about the woman in his backseat, keeping her words locked away like a treasure. He looked at the peppermint wrapper she had left behind and knew that for 1 hour he had been the most important man in the world. Decades after that fateful night, his son Thomas was clearing out the family attic after his father had passed from this world. The attic was a sanctuary of silence, smelling of cedar and aged paper, filled with the remnants of a long and honest life. As Thomas's trembling hands brushed away the thick layer of dust from a cardboard shoebox, the afternoon sunlight filtered through a cracked window, illuminating the particles in the air as if the past itself were trying to materialize before his eyes. Inside was a small, handheld dictaphone and a single cassette tape labeled in his father's steady, looping cursive, "The Angel in My Cab." Thomas remembered his father as a quiet man, a man who had driven the streets of Los Angeles for 40 years without ever mentioning the famous faces that must have graced his backseat. He had seen the rise and fall of cinematic empires from his driver's seat, yet he remained a silent observer. But as the reel began to turn, the silence of the attic was shattered by a voice that felt like a hauntingly alive melody. As the tape hissed to life, Thomas sat on the floorboards, feeling as though he were discovering a treasure the world had long since forgotten. He didn't hear the rehearsed, breathy giggle of the icon. He heard the sound of a human heart breaking and mending in real time. He heard the rustle of a silk gown, the clinking of heavy diamonds, and the weary, heart-wrenching confession of a girl searching for a way home. He heard her talk about the peppermint and the kitchen window, her voice cracking with the weight of 30 years of silence. His father's voice was there too, a calm anchor in the storm of her grief. The problem with history is that it remembers legends as cold statues, but this recording was a living, breathing testament to the vulnerability that the cameras were never allowed to capture. Thomas listened as she spoke of her dream cottage and the grandchildren she would never get to hold. He heard the moment his father handed her a peppermint, and the raw sob that followed made Thomas weep. He realized his father had kept this tape not as a trophy, but as a sacred trust, a memory of the night he had helped a fallen star find her light again in the darkness. Thomas held the silk scarf, the captured cloud tucked in the bottom of the box, still soft and smelling faintly of jasmine, and felt a profound connection to a woman he had only ever seen on a screen. He wondered if the world was ready to hear the truth, or if the legend was all they really wanted. We remember the shimmering platinum hair and the white dress billowing over the subway grate, but on that secret tape, we finally hear the heartbeat of a woman who just wanted to be home. The world has spent decades dissecting the mystery of her departure from this life, searching for answers in medicine cabinets and police reports. But the truth was never in a doctor's file or a detective's notebook. It was preserved in the magnetic hiss of a taxi driver's tape, a permanent reminder that even the brightest stars are often just children looking for a hand to hold in the dark. The final emotional payoff of this story isn't her global fame or her beauty, but the quiet, simple dignity she was given by a stranger when she felt utterly invisible. Marilyn Monroe taught us that you can be adored by millions and still starve for a single ounce of genuine connection. Elias gave her the one thing the silver screen never could, the permission to be human, to be messy, and to be tired. He didn't see a goddess. He saw a daughter in pain, and in doing so, He gave her the only night of peace she had known since she was a girl named Norma Jean. This story is a vital reminder that the most important people in our lives aren't always the ones in the history books or on the news. They are the ones who listen when we speak, who notice when we are shivering, and who offer a small kindness without expecting anything in return. The recording captures Marilyn more beautifully than any movie she ever made because it captures a soul brave enough to finally set down its mask and be seen for exactly who she was. We live in a world obsessed with celebrity, but on that night in 1961, the most famous woman in the world learned that success meant nothing compared to an honest connection with a kind man in a yellow cap. As the legends of old Hollywood fade like old photographs in the sun, this story remains as a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever felt lost in their own life. It reminds us that no matter how famous or how forgotten we are, we all share the same deep universal need to be seen for who we truly are. It teaches us that a single act of kindness can echo through the decades, providing comfort to people who weren't even born when the words were spoken in that moving car. The image of that silk scarf still resting on a mahogany dresser today and the crinkled peppermint wrapper tucked in the back of an old diary are the final, tangible proof that she was more than a flickering shadow. She was real, she was here, and for one night in a taxi, she was finally home. She was not a mystery to be solved, but a heart to be understood and cherished. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that fame means nothing if we do not use our lives to help others. Feel seen and heard in the dark. Marilyn's secret recording is a haunting reminder that while fame is fleeting, a single act of kindness lasts forever. If this journey into her soul touched you, please subscribe to ensure these forgotten voices are never silenced again. Turn on notifications to join us as we continue to exhume the hidden truths buried beneath the silver screen.